Hi, in this video we are going to look at the facial nerve, the different fiber it has and the different nuclei it has, and then the course of the facial nerve and the different structures the facial nerve passes through and the different structure it supplies. So here is the fourth ventricle and here is the brainstem, and here is the medulla, here is the pons and the midbrain. So we will look at the frontal view and the lateral view. So here are the 6 cranial nerve nuclei. If we divide the frontal view into two, the left and right, so we put here the facial nerve, the motor nuclei. Here are the motor nuclei. Now, the motor nuclei has the upper part and the lower part. Here we draw the diagram and show the homunculus and how the corticonuclear fibers supply the upper and lower part of the facial nuclei. So here, the lower part of the fibers, they originate from this part of the cortex, and then the upper part of the body is supplied from here, and then the trunk and then the face. So here we draw the face. From here, the neurons, they send the fiber down to the facial nerve. So here we show the homunculus on the other side as well. And if we divide the face into two, the upper and lower, right here. Now let's draw the nuclei. Here are the upper and the lower part of the facial nuclei. Now the fibers to the upper part of the facial nuclei on both sides will receive the fiber from the ipsilateral, means the same side of the cortex, and contralateral, means from the opposite side of the cortex. And the lower part of the facial nuclei only receives the fiber from the contralateral. If this is the nucleus on the right side, it will receive the left cortical nuclear fibers. If it's the left, it will receive the right cortical nuclear fibers. If we draw a face here and then divide the face into left and right, and then look at how the different part of the facial nuclei supply the different part of the face. So here we divide the face into two. Now the upper part of the facial nuclei will supply the upper part of the face. So we just show one side. And the lower part of the facial nuclei will supply the lower part of the face, right? Now, if there is a lesion in the corticonuclear fibers, imagine this is example A. Now, the upper part of the facial nucleus will receive the fiber from the ipsilateral, even if the contralaterals are damaged, and the lower part will not receive, so there will be a lesion or palsy in the lower part of the face. Now, if there is a lesion in the facial nerve fibers, right, from the nucleus to the face here, this is example B, where the whole half of the face will be having a palsy or a lesion, right? So this is about the facial nerve, upper and lower part. Now let's look at the parasympathetic nuclei. So here are the parasympathetic nuclei. It has two nuclei, the upper one and the lower one. The upper one is the lacrimatory nucleus and the lower is salivary nucleus. So the lacrimatory nucleus will give the fiber to the lacrimal glands. So if we draw the lacrimal glands here, here is the lacrimal gland and it gives the fiber, and the salivary nucleus will give the parasympathetic fibers to the sublingual gland and submandibular gland. So here is the submandibular ganglion where it terminates. If we look at another nucleus, so here are the nucleus of tractus solitarius, right? This nucleus receives the fiber from the tongue, which are the taste sensation. These fibers receive the taste sensation from the tongue, and it comes to the nucleus of tractus solitarius. So here we draw the tongue, and these fibers will be taken to the nucleus tractus solitarius. If we look at one more nucleus and the fibers, it is the spinal nucleus of the trigeminal system, and it receives the fibers from the ear, auricles, or the external auditory meatus or the tympanic membrane. It receives the pain and temperature. So now let's look at the facial nerve. It goes back and wraps around the sixth cranial nerve, and it makes a bulge in the fourth ventricle, which is called the colliculi facialis. And then it exits on the front of the brainstem, here as well on the other side. And it receives the fibers, the parasympathetic fibers, from the lacrimatory and salivary nuclei, if we show on the lateral side here as well. Now, these are the outgoing fibers, right? They are the outgoing fibers. Now, it also receives the incoming fibers, which are the taste fibers to the nucleus of tractus solitarius and the pain and temperature fiber to the spinal nucleus, right? All of these fibers together make the facial nerve. So the facial nerve has sympathetic fibers, the sensory fibers, and the motor fibers. The motor fibers of the facial nerves are called the facial nerve proper, and the other fibers together makes the nervus intermedius. So here again, the facial nerve proper, the parasympathetic fibers, and then these are the outgoing fibers, and then the incoming fibers, which are the taste and the pain and temperature fibers. So the facial nerve, it starts with F. Remember, F for 5, okay? It has different kind of fibers, or at least 5 different kind of fibers. So now let's look at the facial nerve course. So here we draw the brainstem, and then the posterior cranial fossa, the middle cranial fossa, and the interior cranial fossa. So here is the eyeball, and all these structures we have to draw here, so we will look at the course of the facial nerve. And here's the lacrimal gland, and here is the tongue, and under the tongue we'll draw the sublingual gland, and then the submandibular gland, and we draw the trigeminal ganglion here. And this trigeminal ganglion, which has here's the foramina ovale, through which the mandibular branch will go down and give a branch to the tongue, which is called the lingual nerve, and which receives the sensation from the interior 2/3 of the tongue. And here is the pterygopalatine ganglion, and here is the orbital cavity, and here is the inferior orbital fissure. Now all these structures are important, so I draw it first. Now let's look at the course of the facial nerve. Remember, the motor fibers of the facial nerve are called the facial nerve proper, and the other fibers together make the nervus intermedius. So the facial nerve, which is the 7th cranial nerve, will along the 8th cranial nerve leave the cranial cavity through the internal auditory canal and pass through the internal auditory meatus to reach the middle wall of the medial ear. Now, when it reaches the middle wall of the medial ear, so it will go pass through the facial canal and then exit through the mastoid foramen. So here we imagine that this is the middle wall of the medial ear. So here, if we draw the middle wall of the middle ear outside here as a box, and then show how the facial canal and through which the facial nerve passed through. So here is the middle wall, and the facial nerve will enter on the interior side of the middle wall on top, and it will go through the bony structure. And there is a canal within this bony structure called the facial canal. So here is the geniculate ganglion, right? And here's the geniculate ganglion. And here we will show the facial canal. This is the facial canal, and it goes back to reach the posterior wall. And this is the posterior wall. And then it will go down to the floor of the middle ear and then exit through the mastoid canal. So here is the facial nerve going through the facial canal, and of course with it the nervous intermedius fibers, right? So here is the interior wall of the middle ear. Now let's look at the fibers. The first fibers that we will take is the lacrimated fibers. When it reaches the geniculate ganglion, it leaves the geniculate ganglion and it's called the greater petrosal nerve, and it will get to the middle cranial fossa where it will leave through the foramina lacerum, and it will reach the pterygopalatine ganglion, and from there it will get into the orbital cavity through the inferior orbital fissure and then reach to supply the lacrimal gland, right? Now we look at another set of fibers, and these are the salivary fibers. It will go along the facial nerve through the facial canal, and when it reaches the posterior wall of the middle ear, where it will leave the posterior wall and jump to the interior wall. So here are the posterior and interior canaliculus. So if we draw the canaliculus here in our this diagram, so here is the posterior canaliculus and here is the interior canaliculus. It's in the posterior wall and it's in the interior wall. Through this, it will jump from one wall to another wall, and along this there's other fibers which are the taste fibers which has a ciliary ganglion in the geniculate body, and together they will make the chorda tympani nerve. So these fibers will go and reach the lingual nerve of the mandibular branch of the trigeminal nerve, and along with it, it will go to the tongue and it will supply or take the taste from the interior 2/3 of the tongue. And now the salivary fibers will also reach the lingual nerve, and it will go along the lingual nerve and it will terminate in the mandibular ganglion, and from there it will supply the sublingual gland and the submandibular gland. So these are the three type of fibers. Now let's look at the pain fibers, which goes along the facial nerve. When it reaches the posterior wall, it will leave the facial canal and it will supply the or receive the fiber from pain and temperature from the ear, the external auditory meatus. And now let's look at the facial nerve proper. When it goes down, it gives a branch to the stapedius muscle here, and then it gives the branch posterior to the posterior auricular branch, the nerves to the stylohide muscle, and the nerves to the posterior belly of the digastric muscle, and then the temporal, the branch, the zygomatic branch, the upper and lower buccal branches, and the marginal mandibular branch, and the cervical branch of platysma. So this is all about the facial nerve.